is involved in. But he has filed a report. He's written an article, and it's addressed directly at the police minister. He says, "Please, Minister, explain the disconnected SAPS and the banning of guns for self-defense." Yousef, salamu alaikum, welcome to the program, and I'm absolutely fascinated by the type of work you're involved in. Nice to have you on the show.
Wa alaikum salam, jazakallah. Thanks for having me, Julie, and salamu alaikum to your listeners as well.
Okay, so what does an independent arms analyst do, and how did you come by being involved in this space?
So just to contextualize it a bit effectively, I say sort of the independent arms analyst part is sort of my night job. My day job is drastically different from it.
Okay,
it's
so
really
this is your passion. This is your
my passion, exactly.
Okay.
So it's a hobby that's become a bit of an obsession and takes way too many nights of my time off.
Alhamdulillah.
But effectively, just to put it in a nutshell, what I do, I study effectively arms transfers in the world, different forms of legislation in different countries, and try and piece together and understand effectively what it means for communities that are let's say exposed to this legislation and have to comply with these legislation. And this actually became sort of a passion when we looked at the 3D printing or the 3D printing of firearms. I don't know if you know the saga.
Yes.
About 10 years ago it started.
Absolutely.
And it's become a lot more prolific and actually a lot more advanced, to the point where you could now print, a semi-automatic rifle in your house without a significant cost, and it's something that's extremely reliable.
So tell me, Zain, if you do that, if you print your own gun, do you still need to have it licensed? Or, I mean, can you imagine criminals doing this all the time and having a cache of ammunition, of guns that they don't need to account for, and there's no there's no trail to follow up and possibly hold them to account?
Yes, look, so in South Africa, under our current legislation, it would be illegal, but I mean, the fact that something's illegal hasn't actually stopped any criminals anyway, that's effectively it. We do already see cases, quite a few actually, where criminals are printing guns and actually, I would say, stockpiling or at least distributing them amongst their networks. There was a recent post I read, I think it was about 4 or 5 days ago in Australia, where they picked up one of the latest versions of what's called the FGC9, which is that semi-automatic pistol carbine, let's say effectively, which has been printed in Australia and was captured in a drug bust by the Australian police, along with several other 3D printed firearms. And this is one of many that we at least that we're beginning to see, which means the stuff that you're not seeing is quite prolific.
Okay. You have grave concerns around the issue of obviously repealing of gun ownership for self-defense. Talk to us about that, bearing in mind that we know because guns in other countries, very especially America, are so freely available, they have these crazies going around and mowing people down in schools or whatever person's gripe is. All he does is just take his weapon and goes and kills a whole host of people and maims a whole host of other people. Could that not then be a scenario in our country if guns are freely available or given, without the type of, criminality that is even in self-defense? If you defend yourself and you maim or kill a criminal, you are the bad guy. You are the guy that possibly will end up in jail.
Yeah. Look, so I personally don't believe that that firearms should be something which should be, sort of something that you can buy in a vending machine type of scenario, which is more your American scenario. I don't believe that you should have that easy access to it for a number of reasons, primarily that you have to prove some degree of competence before you handle a firearm. That is my own personal belief. So I'm not too much a fan of I say the American scenario, but there are a lot of cases where in places where firearms are completely restricted, very, very difficult to get access to, you have seen criminal elements or people who are intent on harming others gain access to these firearms and then cause massive damage and massive civilian casualties, right? There are cases like in France, for instance, where there was an attack on the music concert. Those were conducted by terrorists who effectively had or had procured access to guns in a country where you could not procure access to those guns. There were shooters in Germany in exactly likewise the same scenario, effectively, where there was extremely strict gun legislation, and therefore the only guys who had access to the guns were the bad guys who were willing to go through whatever channels they had to get access to these guns. To cite another example, in Australia, firearm ownership is extremely restricted, yet you see a continuous emergence of criminals having access to guns, and where they're having trouble accessing it now, they're using technology, like I mentioned actually, with 3D printing. They're just printing and continuing to use it for whatever nefarious purpose they intend to. And so I think the notion that if we had to ban guns, that criminals would somehow follow suit, there might have been a period in the world where that was possible, maybe about 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Okay.
Now it's not completely effectively unrealistic. I just can't see a case where that happens, not with the number of firearms in circulation in the world.
Okay, Zain, let's bring the story back to South Africa and your article where you are saying that if this bill is to be passed, the normal, the ordinary citizen will not be allowed to own a firearm for self-defense. And should you use a legally possessed firearm in self-defense, you can be charged for using the weapon and you will be criminally liable, even though your life was probably at stake there. So, but you still will be criminally liable. And you go on to say that this legislation is not only absurd, it's also farcical. Why?
Yes. So, I mean, effectively, look, there's a number of problems with the proposed legislation. One is of course the removal of the clause for self-defense, but the second is that they remove wording in the current legislation which allows you to use your firearm for any lawful purpose. And we believe fundamentally that the reason that was removed is that if you do use any of your other firearms, let's say something which is licensed for sporting or for hunting purposes, for instance, if you had to use that in self-defense, that does open an avenue effectively to charge you. Maybe not with defending yourself for the murder, but for contravening the Firearms Act as it would be amended. And that would result in you then losing all of your weapons and potentially facing whatever charges are then envisioned by the NPA at that point in time. So that's sort of where that notion of being criminally charged comes from, and I think it's well understood and accepted within the current firearms lobby and people who reviewed the bill that seems to be the intent of the bill. Why I argue effectively that the proposed legislation is nonsense to a large degree or the other is there's two arguments fundamentally that the minister and whoever else drafted this legislation come up with. Fundamentally, they make the argument that one, you don't need a firearm for self-defense because the state can protect you, and that seems to be something exactly laughing at it is already point enough. And then the second thing is that private firearm ownership is the primary source of illegal firearms that are proliferating through the country. And you'll hear Seki Tele talk about closing the tap on illegal firearms. Now, I mean, in the first case, that the SAPS has effectively failed to meaningfully address any form of crime. I mean, you can take it across the board: murder, rape, kidnappings. We in the Muslim community have been plagued with a set of prominent businessmen who've been kidnapped. How many have been solved today? Right. So we know that the SAP has completely failed in their mandate to protect South African citizens. So that first argument is utter nonsense. The second one is that, without a doubt, if you look at it, the SAPS, the South African Police Service, is probably the largest single proliferator of illegal firearms in the country. We know that there was Chris Prinsloo, Colonel or ex-Colonel Prince Prinsloo, was implicated in arming gangs in the Cape Flats. I mean, they say effectively he flooded the Cape Flats with illegal firearms. We know now that Lieutenant Charles Kinnear was effectively was murdered for investigating the CFR, which is the Central Firearms Registry, which is run by the SAPS and members of the SAPS, He was murdered for investigating corruption at the CFR, which was also implicated in arming the criminal underworld. So, I mean, it's laughable for the SAPS to go ahead and say, you know, private firearm owners are actually responsible for this when they seem to be directly implicated in arming the entire criminal underworld. And that's ignoring SAPS members who've lost their firearms, who rent out their firearms for nefarious purposes, and those who are directly involved in crimes such as hijackings, which seems to feature on the newspapers every other day.
Your take on the VIP protection budget of 1.7 billion rands, which obviously does involve all sorts of firearms and heavy-handed tactics.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that also in and of itself is indicative of the mindset of the political elite, where the intent is to then disarm or disarm private citizens, decrease the budget for the SAPS. We are now making an accommodation for an increased budget for effectively the political elite. I mean, that's effectively the VIP budget in a nutshell. Now, I have no doubt that, you know, there are members of cabinet, I mean, the president, for instance, ministers who would need some form of protection. That's a given.
Okay, we seem to have lost Zain there. We had 3 minutes left to the interview. If we can't raise him again, we'll take an ad break and continue with our show. But Zain, if you are listening in, Jazakallah very much for this very concise article that you have written as an independent arms analyst, talking about obviously the issue around gun ownership and how you open yourself up to being charged criminally, even as a legal gun owner, if you use your gun and maim or kill a criminal, even in self-defense. Lots to think about around that one. 8:48 exactly. We're going for a short ad break, and when we get back, we are going to be talking about an event not to be missed, and that is strategies for growth and building resilience in a post-COVID world.
My Lord, show me right from wrong.
Huda SA is an organization that focuses primarily on assisting communities within the Etequeni region by collaborating with existing Islamic centers, mosques and madrasas. Your contribution goes towards the uplifting of orphans and vulnerable children, including vulnerable families, by assisting with education, welfare, nutrition and maintenance of madrasas, mosques and Islamic community centers. Make the difference. Donate to